Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Allied forces confronting the atrocities of the Nazis, that is, the Holocaust. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Some 15 million civilians were killed by the Nazi regime and 6 million were Jews. But anti-Semitism was nothing new in Europe, lingering for centuries until it bubbled up to what the Germans call the final solution. These days, anti-Semitism still haunts modern Europe, with many Jews immigrating to places outside the continent, especially Israel and the United States. This morning, we want to take a look at that period and how it has impacted the people and ultimately the world. In our studios this morning, Martin Pereboom. He is the Dean of the Fulton School of Liberal Arts, also teaches history at Salisbury University, has been teaching a course on the Holocaust. And also Leslie Yarmel, costume designer for Salisbury University's Theater and Dance Department. And welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, let me just first of all, and Leslie, I'll start with you. As we look back, this 70 years now since all these films really revealed what had happened in Nazi Germany, what are your reflections? I mean, what is your sense about the meaning of this event that occurred?
You know, it's a very personal event for me because my grandparents were survivors. They were Viennese Jews, and they narrowly escaped Nazi Germany. I grew up with them. They grew to be quite old, and I experienced through my grandmother the suffering of the losses and the guilt that she experienced. She lost her parents, her sister, nieces, brothers-in-law. Her father committed suicide before taken to a camp. One niece was found in a mass grave and probably survived the war, but then was shot after it. So I grew up with that experience, and the what speaks to me actually now are many things, including actually what it means to be a decent person in society. And I think that the survivors didn't always survive they didn't survive alone. They survived because there were decent human beings who did very good acts in addition to the horrific acts. And those were people who had personal ethics and morals and could see beyond what everyone else was buying into, and didn't buy into the fear tactics of the Nazi regime and risked their lives and helped. And I think that we can all learn from that. I think that's the important lesson that I would like to have people think about.
By the way, you just mentioned a moment ago that there was some guilt. What did you mean by that?
It's a very, very common phenomenon among survivors of the Holocaust. You know, my grandmother was able to escape because she married my grandfather. They actually married the week of Kristallnacht, which means they each went to the synagogues. 45 synagogues were destroyed in Vienna alone on the night of Kristallnacht. And so they couldn't go to a synagogue, but they each had to go to the place where they got married alone. Nobody came to the ceremony. But they had to do that because otherwise, because of the limits, all the difficulties of getting exit visas, because she married my grandfather, she was able to get out. But the rest of her family couldn't. They were actually from a smaller town where there was a smaller quota to the United States to get out. And she, of course, she left her parents behind thinking that they'd be safe because older Jews were not picked on early on in the regime. And, of course, then they died and were killed. And she, of course, always asked herself, why me? Why shouldn't I have stayed behind? Maybe I could have done something to protect them. And this is a very, very common phenomenon. There are many versions of this.
By the way, from what your relatives tell you, I mean, one of the things that has always struck me about the Holocaust is that on one level, one should have been able to see this coming. And yet, Jews in Germany, but elsewhere, didn't seem to believe that this was going to happen. I mean, were they caught by surprise, you think, by what was about to take place? Because there were periods of anti-Semitism, well, throughout Europe. And they would come, and then they would sort of disappear a little. And then they come, right, you have pogroms, and then they would disappear. They just didn't anticipate this, or nobody anticipated it, I think?
Oh, I think many people anticipated. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism, as you just said.
Right.
My grandfather, in fact, was well aware of it. He was from a secular family and therefore went to university, several generations in Vienna and very much part of society. His father was an inspector on the steamships on the Danube. So he prepared very early for the possibility of leaving and put his name on the list of the quota. So he had what they called a low number for an exit visa. And that's why he could get out. That's why my grandmother could get out with him. They also had to have sponsors. And part of it is that the process for getting an exit visa was incredibly complex. Many countries had quota systems for how many Jews they allowed from a given place to come to the countries, United States, for example. So Baden, where my grandmother was actually born, a small town, a spa, probably had nobody. There was no quota for Baden. There was a higher quota for Vienna. She had to first establish residency in Vienna by marrying my grandfather to even be considered. Then you had to have a sponsor. You had an affidavit of somebody who would pay for you should you not earn a living. My grandmother had a secretary that earned close to nothing, and at the consulate, the gentleman, the American consulate who looked at her said that, well, she's a pretty girl, she'll always get a job. One of my grandfather's uncles got an affidavit from a total stranger by going through a phone book. But not everyone was that lucky. So you could be well aware of what was going on, but what do you do with that? That doesn't necessarily mean that you can get out. And so it's not a fair judgment to say that people weren't aware and therefore should have known and should have left. It wasn't that easy.
Yeah. Martin, I want to turn to you. So what are your thoughts in terms of the significance of the Holocaust? We're 7 years out. We've obviously had a lot of genocides that have occurred since then in various parts around the world. What's your sense about the significance of this event?
I think on one level you have to acknowledge, first of all, the utter senselessness of it. I think that we have a tendency when something big happens, something as huge an event as the Holocaust and World War II, to sort of ascribe some sort of significance to it. As I was getting ready to teach this course, I was involved in a little discussion about use of terms such as Shoah and Holocaust, which of course we use, and I don't really have a big problem with using those terms, but they themselves have become controversial in the sense that they might connote for some a sense of sacrifice, that there's somehow some kind of religious significance to this. And I would pretty much, even as a devout Episcopalian, reject that notion that somehow there's some purpose to this, some sort of sacrifice. It's an utterly senseless crime. We do our best to understand how it came to happen, but it was a crime. It was an atrocity. And to go to what Leslie was just talking about, the intent of the Germans, the intent of the Nazis to kill the Jews, prevailed here in a way that really sort of overwhelmed any sense of what people could anticipate or could have done. It's really the perpetrators who made this happen.
Well, let me ask you this, because there were a large number of well-educated people who bought into anti-Semitism in Germany. And one of the things that it's always, I thought, made particularly the Holocaust unique is that this was a highly educated group of people who utilized 20th century technology to carry out this atrocity. I mean, there's almost an incongruity, because you would think that progress being made, technological developments, that you would move away from that, and yet there were many people who were well-educated who bought into this.
Indeed, and they used the technology, the techniques of mass production to murder people, to produce death. So that is really the thing that I think makes the Holocaust unique among 20th century genocides, in that this was an otherwise highly accomplished civilization in terms of adapting technologies, being a modern, advanced industrial society that really went nuts. It's I think of it sometimes as kind of a cancer on civilization, National Socialism, in the sense that somehow something went completely wrong, and the things that we would attribute to a progressive, modern society, advancing society, was turned instead to totally destructive purpose.
Do you think there was something within the German culture that attributed this, or do you think it could have happened in any modern European country at the time?
That's a really good question. I think there are attributes to this that are uniquely German, but I wouldn't say uniquely German in the sense that Germans are uniquely capable of evil. There are hallmarks of German culture, German values in what we see unfold in the course of the Holocaust. But I won't say that somehow the Germans are morally, more vulnerable or morally more culpable than any other people in Europe or anywhere else in the world.
I want to turn to now whether we're 70 years out, and yet as I read about Europe, lots of anti-Semitic incidents that are occurring. As I mentioned earlier, that there are a lot of Jews who've decided to leave Europe now. Leslie, what do you make of that? I mean, the fact that here we are this far out. I was reading actually about Poland, in which there was large percentages of Poles who would not want their relative to marry a Jew, or who would not want to work with them. I mean, that's quite striking. And even in countries such as France, for example, you have a good chunk of people who display what at least the surveyors called anti-Semitic feelings. I mean, 70 years out, and yet we have this going on. What do you make of that? What's happened? What didn't happen?
Well, it's once again, Hitler did not. I think I just said this, did not invent anti-Semitism,
yeah.
And Germany was not well known for being the most anti-Semitic country by any means. There are other countries that actually were more notorious, were supposedly worse. And even during the war, there are many Jews, many survivors, who would say that actually they were safer in Germany even during the war than they were in some other countries, because there were the German Jews, Austrian Jews, were so much a part of society that they, of course, had good friends and were at different levels in society, so that they were indistinguishable. My grandfather was blonde and blue-eyed. So was my grandmother. So you wouldn't have noticed who they were walking down the street. There was nothing like they were wearing strange clothes. But I've been doing a lot of research on dress of Jews and identifying markers. And it doesn't surprise me in some ways, because, the yellow badge, for example, is something that was worn throughout Europe, was required that Jews wore for hundreds of years, until Napoleon. And Hitler, 120 years later, basically just brought this back. But it's very disturbing. It's alarming. I've lived in Europe. It scares me. I don't know what to make of it. And yet it's never died. In Italy, that was always well known for being rather tolerant of the Jews. I personally had experiences as far back as the 80s of people saying, that Jews had ruined the world, or that I was part of this, that seemed to come out of nowhere. And it's always useful to find a scapegoat. Jews have always been an easy scapegoat. Why not turn to a group that has this long history to target when times are rough? And there, of course, there's the whole issue of Israel and the Palestinian crisis. And in Europe, there is more support for the Palestinians, and Jews are often aligned with Israelis, which is not, of course, always the
Right.
case. Not all Jews believe that the conservative policies of Israel are valid. And so, those lines, of course, can easily be grayed, right?
Right. Because one of the things that struck me was that there seems to be sort of this division within European society. On the one hand, you get this underlying anti-Semitism that exists. On the other hand, you get political leaders. I mean, obviously, there's Angela Merkel, who talks about it was a disgrace, and there was a great, that she was proud that there was 100,000, I think 100,000 Jews who live in Germany, although obviously there were many more before the war, and even the French president said, no, this is, to Jews, this is your country. Martin, is there that division, do you think, that on the one hand there's sort of this lower undertone, and on the other hand you have the politicians speak a different language? I mean, how do you read that?
Well, I think that the politicians are champions of civil society, and I think that's a really critical thing to point out. And one thing that's so important in terms of understanding the Holocaust is that the government and the civil authorities had turned against the Jewish people, and that's profoundly different from the situation that we find ourselves in today. It's difficult to convey sometimes to students, and maybe this is a good thing, really how horrible this was. I mean, that sounds like an understatement, but I think for our students to sort of conceive of the circumstances in which people found themselves in the late 30s, even in Germany or Austria, where a child has a birthday party in Vienna several months after the Nazi takeover, and nobody comes because she's Jewish. And that's something that the government would applaud, that meanness. And even just on that childish level, to appreciate how terrible that situation was. And so I think these attitudes persist. And of course, as a historian, I'm inclined to think, it's going to be impossible to eradicate these sort of underlying prejudices that just persist no matter what. Anti-Semitism in Europe, of course, had been enmeshed in religious beliefs, the idea that, Jews used the blood of Christian children, or these crazy sort of folk beliefs that had crept into the sort of, I guess we would call them urban legends today. Those sorts of things die so hard and continue to exist even today. But it's so important. This really underscores the importance of civil society and the responsibility of leaders to ensure that people's rights are protected. The big difference in France today is that the government, the police, will protect Jews going to synagogue. It's terrible that they have to do that people can't just freely worship as they would choose. But the fact that the government and civil society stands behind equality and stands against prejudice is critically important. And of course, part of what's going on in Europe today as well is a strong anti-immigrant sentiment among many people. There's a strong anti-Muslim sentiment. And all of this it's very, very complicated. And a lot of the anti-Semitic incidents involve young, sort of disaffected Muslims in those countries. So it's very complicated.
Leslie, I want to ask you something. Germany, I assume you've been there. How do you feel that the Germans have handled this? I mean, I remember a number of years back, I remember going there and talking to one German. She was, I guess, in her 20s. And essentially, she was confronted with some incident, and accusing her, she was from the land of the perpetrators, right? And I remember her expressing this sort of like, well, I didn't do anything, right? I mean, how do you assess where German society is and how they've handled this?
I think Western Germany handled it very well, and I think that Germans, on a whole, are much more aware of the devastation of the Holocaust and their responsibility for it than probably any other country in Europe. Italians like to think it didn't exist, and say that they weren't involved in it, and there were many wonderful stories of what people did to save Jews, but there was no country in Europe that really does not carry a great deal of responsibility. There were greater problems, for example, in Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union, and Martin can speak probably more intelligently about this, really put this underground and did not talk about it. And so there is this a great deal of, there's a great lack of knowledge. And I agree with the Germans, the young Germans today, they were not part of it. And I don't think that they need to feel guilty personally. On the other hand, I'm glad they do, and and they need to be aware of it. And but I don't think that. I think Germany specifically has handled it very well.
Martin, what kind of lessons do you think that the United States has learned? I mean, during the period, there was a boat that was turned away, and there was a number of times where boats were turned away. They were with Jews who were trying to get out of Europe as this Nazi rose to power. And I mean, what do you think we've learned, particularly as we intervene in, say, genocides around the world? We had Rwanda where we didn't. We had Bosnia where we decided we would, although reluctantly. Kosovo, how do you read that?
The real learning curve, and I'm thinking of this from the perspective of my students and as an educator, so critically important to understand the profound importance of the civil rights movement in this country. I think when students first think about the Holocaust, they kind of think, well, why didn't they just come to the United States? They sort of assume everything was great here. And of course, there was anti-Semitism here in the United States. It was not state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It wasn't persecution. It wasn't certainly murderous in its intent. But I think it's really important for students to understand that discrimination was legal. Of course, segregation was omnipresent in the United States and still in the 1940s, and including in the armed forces that were fighting for freedom overseas. And so some profound ironies there. But to understand the importance of the civil rights movement in terms of transforming American society and recognizing equality among U.S. citizens, acknowledging equality among human beings in general, that's been a profound transformation for American society. And so I think in terms of the lessons of the Holocaust, we've needed to recognize our own shortcomings as a society in the past and the importance of the labors of so many Americans to bring a greater sense of equality to all. The Holocaust, of course, confronts us with humanity at its absolute worst, and is shocking in that sense, and can really sort of send us running in the other direction in terms of embracing human rights and just embracing kindness, because you realize when people's lives are snuffed out with such brutality that we have to hold on to life and what it has to offer, the good things it has to offer for all we can, whether that's individually or as a society.
Leslie, what do you think we've learned from the Holocaust? What do you think, how have we changed?
I don't know if we have. I think we probably did for some time, and I think over time people forget. I think that the civil rights movement, as Martin was just discussing, is a very positive outcome that I do believe is related as well. And I think that there's it's no accident that there were large numbers of Jews who were extremely active in the civil rights movement because they understood the importance of civil rights and the rights of different communities. But I think that the anti-Semitism today the rising anti-Semitism today is, and general biases is evidence that it's a very slow process. It might be a little better, but the massacres of Jews in history were were nothing compared to the massacres in World War II. That's not progress, right? So I don't know how much we change, although I think historians have numbers that show that we are supposedly better, but I don't know. And one thing that occurred to me while you were speaking was that my grandmother, and this is one thing that's come to me recently because of all the anti-Semitism, my grandmother used to say that you can't trust anyone who isn't Jewish, that everyone who isn't Jewish, Goyim, are all anti-Semites. And I have to say that it haunts me, that saying now, because of the anti-Semitism that I witness, even in this country occasionally. And that saying still haunts me. It comes back.
We were speaking with Leslie Yarmouth. She's a costume designer for Salisbury University's Theater and Dance Department. Also, Martin Parabou He is the Dean of the Fulton School of Liberal Arts and teaches history at Salisbury University, including a course on the Holocaust. And appreciate both of you kind of stopping by and talking with us this morning.
Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.